But I hope you're well. I think I mentioned it to you before, Mr. Jockin. I thought your talk with Johannes, Dr. Niebenhauser on frictionless, I thought that was gold. That was gold.
Thank you.
Like that just had everything condensed right there. That's like your introductory class lecture for 2025 and all of the problems of the world today were really summed up in that conversation very well. So I really enjoyed that. And I'd be curious what anyone's thinking about. I've been thinking about trying to understand Bergson memory better and how the moment we ask where is memory stored, we're in trouble because that's making time spatial and really thinking that deeply, actually. Like if you really take that seriously, what it means. I'm also trying to understand more and more of the AI investment structure. I am very interested by Google, how they've released these new chips that seem to be more going in the direction of narrow AI versus super intelligence, but I may be misunderstood by that. I may misunderstand that, but I find it very interesting. And other things, but I'd be curious what anyone's thinking about.
I think Javier's stuck at work right now or in
Dang
class,
it!
one or the other, and he's just chilling in the background. Actually, Javier, particularly Javier and Luber and me have been talking a lot in our DM together. So, kind of first volley of topics. I think yes, Michael's here too. I think that they know is there's been a lot of tension between Javier and Luber and me, partly on analogy and metaphor. So, for example, and actually, Johannes actually saw a recent article I wrote on relating Aquinas's root with Catagen's and that proportionate identity. And he made a note, he made a recommendation to me, or just remembrance about the analogy of time that Kant uses. It's actually really interesting because he does it's actually a three-term operation. And what that does is it basically says you get basically A to B, and in the C, the third term, you're really trying to find the fit of the fourth term that fulfills the conditions of the first two relationships, of the first two terms. So it's a self-contained map. Then I thought about actually, then the thing that came to my mind was particularly the idea of metaphor that is in Shakespeare, where I think that's really interesting in my mind. Again, this is a little of a riff. That's more of a when Romeo says Juliet is the sun. It's important to know it's a metonymy kind of positionality. Juliet's in the position of the sun, and actually, what you're getting implicitly stated is these objects are extrinsically denominated by Romeo. So it's actually not an analogy; it's a metaphor. And it actually is a self-completed map of the relationship of Romeo to these entities. And then, yeah, and then it has this kind of equivocational power behind it, explosion of signification. You actually notice in that I reread that section of Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. Actually, if you notice in that scene, Romeo actually switches his metaphor. First, she's the sun, then she's a messenger of an angel. Right? It's this quick explosion of references that keep going. And there's nothing to stop it because it's contained. It's a relation to the person. The person is the third. It's almost like the third terms, like currency in the same way. Currency acts as the third term to connect different things together, kind of operating exactly the same operation, in my opinion. These things are distinct, or the tension was. This is me kind of circling around this point to say, so if a proportion identity is when four terms give you a fifth, a new concept or a new name of a reality that all these things are by common root, they are common, not by predication. This is calling from Catagen on that. So if that's the case, that's a fifth term, right? That gives us this effect. So what happens when it's a three term that's self-contained in it? Or I would say Kant's kind of move here, where it's really, again, a self-contained map that of just filling in the gap, basically. Luber, I wish Luber's on the call because I talked to him a little bit about this. And I think Luber's point is very clear on this. So to kind of flesh this story out, when you have a story that it's basically fulfilling a genre that you can already anticipate what the character is going to do. That's an example of a metaphor. Because it's just basically the subject, they already have the expectation, there's new information, so thus that's why it's a surprise. It seems like a surprise. But it's just self-confirmation of the map, of the expectation of the subject, versus what a proportion identity does, it's actually the reverse, the inverse. Your expectation got violated because it's a new order, it's a new reality got presented to you. They didn't even consider before. These are just rough ideas, and Javier can always clarify if I'm misrepresenting points that he wants to clarify about it. But that's something on my mind right now.
That's very interesting, Mr. Ebert. Wonderful to see you this evening. So I hope you've been doing well, and I'm again happy that. So if I'm understanding correctly, and please jump in because it's very interesting, because my bias, of course, then is to think of metaphor as this self-contained system that is very interesting, as you're saying in Shakespeare, when it's entirely kind of saturated, then it, to use the term alluding to Ebert, that it actually then creates this explosion of different mixed metaphors and different kind of ways to think about Juliet. And it's interesting to think about Juliet as in that example, the third, the kind of the girdle point, if you will, right? Whereas in the proportion, like what you're saying on the fifth, it's almost the other way around, but that also is interesting to me because for me, the girdle point appears precisely at the completion of the map. And so there's that kind of inverse that occurs there as well, where when you have a completed system, that can unveil it as not the territory, but that's precisely when it could open you up to the territory or make you turn from it, right? And maybe there's something about a difference in the directionality. I'll have to think more, but I'll just throw it on. Here it is. Good to see you. How have you been, sir?
Good. Are you guys literally talking about Romeo and Juliet?
We were. He was making an example, talking about analogy, metaphor, but yeah, Romeo Juliet came up, etc., so forth.
Okay, so I've been writing a Brainrot Romeo and Juliet, and
Amazing.
it's God, I should literally just read you just a couple lines from it because anyway, what I find, so I actually brought this topic up on IDW last night because I'm just so fascinated with the explosion of meaning vis-a-vis meaninglessness. I really think that brain rot represents I think it's the newest introduction to language since language. I think it is really, really fascinating. And there's always been something about brain rot that feels Shakespearean to the modern reader, in the sense that Shakespeare is unintelligible in some sense to the modern listener, and yet you know that there is a wealth of sort of layered contextual meaning, and you're aware that it's poetry. So Shakespeare is literally inventing words like cool, which previously only denoted, weather, to refer to an interior human state. And all of these things that Shakespeare is inventing are sort of these brilliant metaphorical turns of phrase. So you're aware as a modern listener that you're listening to a language that predates you. So you have an occlusion there, there's an opacity there, and poetic strain. And so the gaps, so to speak, like become almost incommensurate with the map. And so there is a walking into any sort of, let's just say it's Romeo and Juliet, even for the modern viewer of even, the Leo DiCaprio version, let's say. You walk in knowing that there is going to be some of the verbiage is going to sort of like silt past the buckets. And let's see if I can just okay, so I want to just all right, so you guys, some of you may be familiar with Sam Chris. I did not get my idea for Sam Chris. I've been working on this for like a couple years, but he basically saw the same thing, and I'll just read you a very quick moment here. Every day I spawn, this is all brain rot language that he's using. Every day I spawn in emerge wriggling out of my skibbity bolus of slime. Whence and where? LOL IDK. Vibes here be mad shady for real. Shit is not aesthetic. Shit is not bussin'. Shit is burnt out cars piled in barricades across the street. Shit is the end is nigh scrawled across bridges. Shit is roofs caved in, windows boarded, thin trees already rising out the wreckage with roots that slip through gaps in the brickwork to return the brief work of man to the senseless rubble that came before. This sus Ohio realm is my crib. Damn bitch, I live like this. So anyway, we're talking about like a return. Here's the beautiful thing. So we'd think, okay, well, Gen Alpha, sure, for Gen, whatever my Gen is, Gen X, Gen Alpha knows what it means, but I don't. But that is not the case. No, this is the big invention. This is the big change that's happening right here. Gen Alpha also doesn't know what it means. There is a signifier that is now floating independent of the signified, where the signified is absent and the signifier is ambivalent to the signified. There's an and it's never been more perfectly represented in the phrase 6-7. Maybe you guys have seen this. Okay, so I don't know if your kids are saying 6-7 yet. It's something called copy pasta. Now I'm going to get back into freak theory here for a second, right? Copy pasta is this idea, and just the phrase is so brain rotted, right? Copy pasta. Copy pasta is when you take a series, like a chunk of text, and you just reproduce and reproduce. But it's been used to apply to brain rot in the sense that a phrase that is meaningless will gain meaning vis-a-vis a quantitative threshold of copy. So if you copy and share enough, it gains the sort of aura of momentum of meaning without actually referring to a signified. And so when I literally got my kid and her friends together because I was doing all this like little research. I was like, listen, guys, I understand that you're going to say that 6-7 means nothing, but at least do you apply it to a particular valence? Is it like when something is good or something is bad or you like something or anything like this? And they absolutely categorically refused that. They said, absolutely not. If you did that, they warned me, it would no longer be brain rot. It would no longer be vaunted to the status, elevated to the status of brain rot. It would fall into normal language. And anyway, so I really love this. And by the way, I was doing a deep dive last night. What Gen Z calls this phenomenon is, you'll never believe it, the real, the per Lacan. You remember that the real is that which refuses language. That's the definition for Lacan, that which refuses language. And the real for Gen Z pasta copy pasta, is that which refuses semantic determination. So now we come, so anyway, so now I'm using, and so it's inherently poetic, right? Because poetry is sort of about these gaps that force the audience to participate in the structure of meaning. But now we have, and sure, like, what does a poem mean to you? Well, what does it mean to you? It means something different to all of us. Now we have the forced application of the subjective interpretation of language vis-a-vis brain rot, because it literally must mean something different to each person because the signified is absent. So it is brilliant. It is astounding. I think it's actually like incredible, and it brings a new meaning to the concept of the meaning crisis. For now, we actually have a proper meaning crisis, and as I predicted, if I will toot my own Hegelian horn, the saturation that produced the meaning crisis vis-a-vis a copy pasta or a saturative semantics produces a new unit. It does produce meaning. Meaning comes from a saturation of meaninglessness. So we have the basic Hegelian dialectic of something from nothing. And what's one more thing I want to say about this? The last thing I want to say, to just bring it back, I know I've brought this example up many, many times, but here it functions as almost a proof, is semantic satiation. What's known as semantic satiation, where you repeat, your example, for instance, that you like using is airplane, 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 airplane. And of course, I don't push back, but I add to that instead of satiation, which, by the way, the clinical diagnosis for why that happens is, oh, the brain becomes so used to the word that it no longer needs to have it represent a signified. But I don't think that's the way semantic satiation works. I think it's semantic saturation. And actually what happens is when you saturate a ontological bucket sufficiently, that ontological bucket floods, and it goes from determinate to indeterminate. And this is proven out by copy pasta in reverse, where you take a word, it really doesn't matter what it means. It could be airplane, 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 airplane. You bring it into the state from determinate into indeterminacy. And then through the indeterminacy, if you stay with the indeterminacy enough, it becomes its own new ontological unit, new epistemic unit. And I think that's what we're dealing with when we look at these very, very interesting, like, if you get a chance, look up, oh my God, there's a great YouTube called Know Your Meme, which some of you might be familiar with, but there's an amazing episode on chopped chin. I bought property in Egypt. If you look that up, it's about chopped chin, and then like a one-eyed thing, and something about I bought property in Egypt, and that's where he really breaks it down. And he'll use the term the real. He'll be like, try and analyze this. You will come up against the real. Anyway, I love that kids, 12-year-olds, are vaunting and that they're raising the indeterminate of language. They're raising the real and elevating it to the level of like fine art as a meaning crisis, like geode, and that it's sort of implicit in their cognitive stack to sort of lean toward this. I remember when you and I and Cadell and Tim would talk about lack and so on. And I think in the last episode, I may have posed the question that, well, I wonder if maybe this ontological flooding, which of course produces a new plateau, produces a new normal, a new zero, from which now we have a new kind of dynamism. And we were like, at the time, well, we'd have to ask the kids. And what I think we're seeing is that is the case. This flooding produces meaninglessness, yes, but it also produces a new kind of ontological grounding for a new epistemic dynamism. And I think it's fucking fascinating. And so anyway, I'm off to the races with Romeo and Juliet, and I'm having a lot of fun with it because, of course, as you can imagine, it actually quite lends itself to a Shakespearean framework. So that's where I'm at.
That's fascinating. And now I'm thinking 6-7 analogy, metaphor, and comparing those. There's a few things that come to mind. First, I really like what you're saying also with Shakespeare, where there's a kind of meaninglessness, and yet that also brings with it a certain like greater meaning because you don't know what the words are. You have that experience when you read great poetry, right? Like you have to let it wash over you. And I always find, because as you're speaking, there's obviously this motion that seems to be there, right? Like great poetry, you have to have it wash over you, right? You catch it if you don't try to catch it too much. This kind of weird move, right? I also think it's interesting because, when you read, like, where do new words come from? Like when you read the history of how they determine new words, it ain't because a bunch of experts on a panel said this is a new term. It's because people started using it. Like Shakespeare, what's so interesting about Shakespeare, I believe he made the word bedroom as well. I don't think bedroom was a term at the time. But what's so interesting about that is once he used it, clearly lots of people started using it. It had weight. It had a certain motion, right? Because people felt as if it, like this is the question, when a word gets accepted, the trick is we're led to believe, and Derrida critiqued this, Kripke, all these language philosophers, they critique this idea that words are definitions. They're not really definitions. Like when you use words, you don't in your mind say, okay, what am I trying to say and what meets the definition, blah, 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 right? It's more of a certain quick apprehension. And there's also something about a certain coordination, right? Like once I get bedroom, I can quickly and efficiently refer to other people to an idea and they go, oh yeah, I get where you're trying to point me, like where you're trying to move me in thought, right? And then the word spreads, right? Because it works, right? And so there's a way in which words have a lot more to do with a certain motion, like a certain movement. And then it has to move through the people. And if it does, then they add it to the dictionary, not because a bunch of experts got together and said, this is a new word we need. It's not like they see, no, it actually gains social clout because of how it moves through people, right? And one of the reasons it moves through people is precisely because it gives them a sense of like, when they hear the word, their mind can move, they can follow it, they can kind of go with it, right? And it kind of guides them. And also too, like what do people say when they love a poem? And I'll throw it to Javier here in a moment. It moved me. This poem moved me, or this work moved me, or the characters kind of moved me, right? And it's just very interesting because as you're talking about 6-7, there's something in which perhaps in the past, and this is all tentative, I'm interested by what you're saying, because there's something about the 6-7, and that blows my mind they refer to it as the real. That's really something. Didn't know that, and did not know that. But there's something about 6-7 where if it's a pure signifier without the signify, well, it has more motion, right? Like it can move more because it's not bound to a signifier. So it actually gets more motion. And if there's always actually been a certain latency in language of actually being about movement, a certain motion, but it's never been able to saturate somehow to a point where it can just be the motion of the signifier separated from having to refer to the signified, well, that's a fairly remarkable thing because it does. It's almost like, and I'm just thinking of terms. It's almost like the meaning is the motion. Like if it doesn't move you, in what sense is it meaningful, right? And that makes sense because we say it's a meaningful poem because it moves me, or that's a meaningful term because it coordinates my action. I know how to move, right? Well, then it's like, well, now we just have the pure. We have, it's if it moves us, it's meaningful. So what you have that's so interesting in the 6-7 there example is that, of course, it's meaningful because it moves us, right? It is moving us, but then if you give it meaning, it kills the motion. And it's hard to think of something that would be that kind of condition other than a pure signifier, like 6-7, right? Where it's actually a kind of trade-off between meaning and motion, which actually means a pure saturation of both in the motion of how it moves people. And I'm thinking about that too, and I'm now thinking about that in light of what Jockin was saying about analogy and thinking about that as metaphor, and how there's also something about the movement in the like it's moving you toward a certain intelligibility. It's moving you to grasp something. When you compare two things and you see something between them that's not there, your mind in a way is being moved beyond the signified, like what is right there, to get a concept that is actually a new signifier, right? Like is an apprehension, a new signifier, but in a way it's trying to get at something that's not given by signifiers. So there's a kind of motion that's being followed there. And it's interesting to think in 6-7 that's very present. So I very much like what you were saying there, Mr. Ebert. And Mr. Ebert, do you have something else, sir?
And I just
Please.
like to add something. You know the classic interiority move where we say something like, well, you wouldn't understand. There's something about brain rot which sets itself up it's I think what you're saying about movement is very close to the issue, but I think that there's something about it really becomes about the intersubjective synchronicity of the movement as the meaning. And here we're talking about meaning not non-semantically, just like as love or something indeterminately meaningful. So you know, so we almost have to have two definitions of meaning, because what I think is very interesting about Brainrot is that it's disabusing us of semantic meaning in favor of a kind of more meaningfulness. But there's something about the you wouldn't understand, where even those who are interior to the movement don't understand, such that the only way to understand is a moment of synchronicity where both of you go 6, 7. And I've seen it happen with Eartha and her friend, with my kid and her friends. And it's something in their environment will tip them off to 6, 7. It'll either literally be a number 6 and a number 7 somewhere in a sentence, or it'll be a moment of whatever, someone scored a goal and then what, we don't know what, and we're going to go 6, 7. And so there's a synchronistic communalism where the whole, like, you wouldn't get it, has transformed into we don't get it. The only way we get it is through this movement, this synchronistic sort of communalistic movement and moment that happens to come together. And there's something extraordinarily communalistic and I would say sacred about that kind of use of language, where the signified has been removed. And so instead of bedroom, where you're like, okay, I can point to bedroom, this is something where in order to participate, you must feel the moment happening and participate because you feel a moment happening that has no signified. And of course, when we talk about the bigger concepts like love or whatever, like these more difficult concepts, they are also sort of without a signified in a sense, and they are also indeterminate. So I guess this is an ingression into basic workaday language of the indeterminate into the determinate, where we're seeing whole sentences. I mean, people really actually speaking back and forth, really not knowing what the other is saying in any determinate sense, but still somehow figuring out a movement. Okay, I guess this, we're having whatever the general valence of that movement is, but I can see them having conversations which do not have any determinate meaning. And there's something almost ritualistically satisfying about that you can't be had without the lack of the signified. So it's of course, the indeterminate is tantamount to God. The indeterminate is, of course, isomorphic to infinity. So there is something inherently spiritual about this.
No, I think all those are extremely good points. I mean, some things that come to mind. So it's almost like a shared motion, a shared movement, because, for me, a distinction between meaning and belonging, I can get meaning being alone in my apartment, say, working on a story, but I may not feel belonging because no one else understands my story or no one else wants to read it, right? Belonging has to be more like a shared meaning, right? And actually, meaning can threaten belonging because what you find meaningful can actually, isolate you, right? What people ultimately want, they want meaning and belonging. But what's very interesting is when you're talking about the 6, 7, it is kind of in that. It's very interesting because it gives you that belonging, right? And it gives you a meaning, because this is always, and it's interesting to think of theology trying to thread this. I think it's true that there's a certain sacredness in this, because theology is always trying to make you or churches, successful religions, are trying to make you approach a God that you can't totally determine and yet can move you, right? There's this emphasis on worship. There's this emphasis on the word. Like, so I can't let you determine God, because then we're screwed. We have idolatry. And yet I need to somehow present God in a way that moves you and get collective movement. And that is the environment in which people tend to, at least traditionally, find belonging, right? So it's interesting to think of 6-7 as having a kind of apophatic character to it, that there's some sort of apophatic character to it. And also when you say something like, you wouldn't understand, which creates a membrane, and that creates community, because, oh, boomer, you wouldn't get it. And yet the thing they don't get is not getting it. You don't get that you need to not get it. And that's what makes you move, right? Well, that's the beauty. It's like, well, the key to worshiping God is that you don't know what God is, actually. Like, that's the whole thing that you have to enter into, right? It's like, what? And it's that in religion to like, and what do religions often say? You have to come and see. You have to come to the church to get it. If you don't come, you won't get it, right? So there's that kind of like, you have to be moved by it, right? And it's just very interesting to think of how that kind of that structure is shared. I am thinking of the shared motion. I think also it's interesting to think does 6-7 make you more open to the environment? Like you're more open to the world because you're looking for ways that it connects, right? And that it's kind of there. And so there's a kind of motion, there's a kind of movement that you may not be alone in, that other people may have. And it is interesting to think of that motion then with metaphor and what metaphor is doing to intelligibility, right? Like how the analogy works. Like when you get an analogous judgment, you get a sense of intelligibility that you can't necessarily, that you grasp in a kind of not there-ness, a kind of not brought into signification, that then once you grasp it begins to bring it into signification, right? But then if you can entirely render it into signification, it loses a lot of the intelligibility. It loses the principle. And yet, that sweet spot can actually organize behavior. Very more to be said, but I'll pause and throw it to Mr. Rivera and then Mr. Jockin and then Michael. Mr. Rivera, please.
So what's interesting about the 6-7 is when Ebert points out the injunction, right? It's funny because it's sort of like how we can actually enjoy our freedom, in a sense. If they didn't have that injunction, they would be facing the monstrous real, in a sense. But because they have that injunction, they are actually able to experience radical freedom. But this freedom is a little different because it's funny because I feel like what Ebert just said proves something that I've been trying to prove for a while now, that the Sinthome can actually be communal. Because the biggest pushback that I've received about the Sinthome is that it's individualistic, and how could you interact with a bunch of Sinthomes? Well, I think Ebert just proved my case, essentially, that Sinthome can be communal. It's very much possible. And the key factor here is that Sinthome is proof of friendship, right? The engagement of this enjoyment is found in friendship. And it means that you can have a synthomic friendship on something that we don't understand together. And I think that's what I've always been fascinated by the Sinthome, is precisely because this injunction is a creation. But I guess the edit with the Sinthome is that usually the idea is the Sinthome creates its own signified, right? So it's like a private meaning. But what Ebert just displayed with the 6-7 is that, hold on, you can create a Sinthome signifier and have no signified, and that opens up the whole communal space. So it's actually not a private enjoyment anymore. It's not it actually makes what is unintelligible communal. And then I guess the last thing is just like my response to Jockin. It's just like So here's what I like about Kant's analogy, Jockin, okay, is that when he's saying there's a gap between the third term to get to the fourth term, is that for me, the filling of this gap is precisely ideology. Okay, you complete that, it's ideology. Because I've been thinking a lot about what's the difference between ideology and map, and I believe, Daniel, you're right when you say the moment you have a map, you've encountered also the girdle point. The problem that we have is going from ideology, map, girdle point. It's the idea that actually we can't even, most people don't understand that they have a map. And so for me, the Kantian analogy is the perfect symptomatic analogy of what ideology is. Which is why I like to stress it, because it shows that if metaphor is, as Jockin was saying, the map, then ideology is the Kantian analogy. Ideology is fantasy, right? We're filling in the gap. It's only when you realize that there's a gap that you actually go into proper metaphor, right? But I think that's what's so fascinating about the Kantian analogy. It's precisely because I feel like Kant, whether he meant to or not, at least from a psychoanalytic point of view, he definitely revealed analogy that has a kind of symptom, analogy that has a fantasy to it, analogy that has something wrong with it, that wants to fill the gap. So yeah, that's where I'll end there.
No, it was not on my bingo card. That 6-7 would be the communal Sinthome. So you know what does one do? What you're saying. Well, what I'm thinking now, what you're saying on Conte with you, and Brandon, wonderful to have you, sir. 6-7 is so. The weird move with the girdle point is you can actually use the girdle point. That's precisely what you can make your map indestructible. Because you simply say all maps, there's no such thing as a complete system. My system isn't complete. Well, therefore, it's just as good as any other map, actually, right? So you can actually, the girdle point can be used to make your map indestructible, and that's when it's ideology. That's when ideology, so you have ideology to map. So ideology is in trouble. Okay, so this is how I would put it. Ideology is in huge trouble once you realize you have a map, right? You're in trouble. So a way ideology can deal with that, which is kind of one with the map, in a way, the map is when ideology is visible, right? So you could say ideology is when you don't even know you have a map. A map is when your ideology is visible. And the sneaky move of ideology is to then make you go, well, everyone has a map though. And every map is not the territory. And, your map is internally consistent. And there are no essential contradictions. So why would you give it up? And you go, you're right, ideology. And so precisely the moment that could actually be a kind of freedom from ideology, you could say, or movement into the girdle point, could be your damnation in that sense, right? Where you're now totally crystallized and unable to interact with otherness, right? And so there is absolutely a realization of the girdle point that is quote unquote bad. And I am strongly associating the girdle point with analogy because that has to be an apprehended point because it cannot be brought into the consistency of the map without just being part of the map, right? It has to be the point of incompleteness, right? So you can use that incompleteness actually to make your map indestructible, right? Or you could dwell in the girdle point and that would add dimensionality and change a lot, right? Now you're open to surprise, et cetera, so forth, right? So it is not the case that the realization of the girdle point necessarily means you will now escape your map, if you will, or sublate it, negate sublate it, right? That actually could be the point of damnation, which is funny because now I'm thinking about 6-7 as, the communal Sinthome, but also what's the difference between that and worship in a church or something, right? Like, is there a difference? Like, how do those go together? The apophatic of 6-7 versus the apophatic of a tradition. What's the goods? What's the bad, etc. I'll say quickly a few more and then throw it at Jockin here. It is very interesting so the idea of the Sinthome not being communal basically assumes, and I think this is correct, basically assumes that you can't have a signifier without the signified, right? Or certainly could not have a signifier that would spread without the signified, because it would be your own idiosyncratic notion, right? So how could it spread, right? It seems impossible. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have YouTube and the internet, so we darn well can. And there seems to be some sort of magic sauce in 6-7 where you notice it enough times in your environment where you would have a justified reason to bring it up. Because that also seems to be very important. Like, what, maybe if the numbers were 11, 12, maybe that wouldn't spread because the environment is such that 11, 12 just doesn't come up in conversation enough, right? Or it doesn't come up in the world. But 6, 7, that's the sweet spot, baby. Because when you say 6, 7, there's something about it that just sounds fun, right? Like 6, 7. If I say 1, 2, 1, 2, but 6, 7, it's both S's, slides off the tongue. You know, it's got this 6, 7, right? And so there's something about it that, in terms of the audio, like saying it, the sound, it kind of rolls and it sounds interesting. Then it's also like, I see the number 6 and the number 7 in my environment a lot, right? I may not see the number 48 and 49 very much, and then 48 and 49 are hard to say. So there's kind of a sweet spot here that makes it possible to separate the signifier and the signified. And then also 6, 7 is something that teenagers and kids can say, right? Like there's something about that seems more perhaps primed for the youth, right? So it can spread. But I mean, I think it's a very good point where 6, 7 has a evidence of a communal synthome. And then the other thing I'm thinking about, I do think like there's a fantasy in relationships to be able to know what your partner thinks without using words. Like we associate that with intimacy, where I just know what you're thinking. And like people get upset. Like if I have to tell you, screw you, buddy. I thought you loved me, right? Like the whole idea of like some people have a problematic notion, please note, that that intimacy equals mind reading, right? Where you just get it without using words, right? So there's also something about 670 that's scratching that intimacy itch, right? We just have telepathy, baby. We just get it. We don't have to use words. So it's like romantic. There's a kind of eros there, right? Well, that's the libidinal, right? Libidinal and synthome go together, right? So, and it's a communal synthome that has a certain intimacy that creates motion. So that's interesting. And it makes me think of Dante, because again, I just look at that and now I'm thinking of the Paradiso with Dante, because of course 6-7 would make you think of Dante, Daniel, of course, where the image in the Paradiso or the jaybirds are just moving. No one has to exchange words. Like the whole idea of the geometry of of the stars in the heavens is things move. They get the coordination, the love that moves the sun and other stars. Love has this way of coordinating action without signifiers, right? Without putting things into word, right? And that's a meaningful communication, which of course entails a certain signification, but it is not clear what is being signified other than the motion itself. The love is the motion. That's where it gets tricky. Like the love is motion in the Paradiso, right? Like it is the motion itself. And things are in love that are in that motion, right? And they don't have to exchange words. They don't have to exchange words that connect with a signified. You just get it, right? And that kind of motion, perhaps there's some sort of parallel with that in the 6-7 that people associate with intimacy. But I will pause and throw it to Mr. Jockin and then Michael. Mr. Jockin, please.
I wrote in the chat, I love the net, because again, you never know what you're going to get. Who knew 6-7 would become basically our instrument to validate Javier's hypothesis he's had since I saw you guys at the farm. Was that a month ago, 2 months ago? So I absolutely love that, let alone just as an object of conversation. I think this idea, by the way, everybody, I think there's a couple of things I want to say about this 6-7, not since we're talking about it. One is it's an example of metonymy kind of basically not just repetition, it's metonymy reproduction. So when we talk about art in the age of reproduction, it's when a source gets copied over and over again. There's eventually a destruction. This is actually the point of signification, right? There's an aura, signification, destruction of the origin, right? By the repetition, away from the source. Now, there's literally like a genealogy of 6-7 it's who knows how true it is. As the nature of these, it's based on the same status. By the way, actually, another example of this is the cool S. Everyone knows what this is. I don't know if it still exists with the Gen Alphas. You know what I'm talking about. The 6 straight lines, and then you connect with diagonals. Yeah, it's cool S apparently. Anyways, it's these kind of like folklores where we have very, at best, they're basically contemporary mythos. We don't really know where they come from. We have a hypothesis. We couldn't even validate even if we wanted to. They're really a hypothesis. They're not even, you can't verify. So I just, from what I've heard about 6-7 is that apparently it was a song that then streamers took and then referenced it in another content, a completely different domain. And then those streams became popular, and now it's become this, non-signified, silly word. Where, and by the way, it's always with the hand gesture too, which comes from the video, I believe, music video where this came from originally. So it's like these carried of domains away from the source slid over, giving completely, eventually, now being so stripped away from its origin. The only meaning it has is the reference to itself. I think what this does, in my mind, from the art history background and graphic design background, is Dadaism. Dadaism took language and repeated it, uses imagery, repetition of imposition, different scales, different arrangements to destroy signification. The point was, don't look at language as a thing that represents sounds or represents words. Look at the shape. Just look what's actually in front of you, in front of your eyes this whole time that you didn't see. And it's kind of nihilistic stance. It's to show by the destruction of signification by word and sound is still meaning, because there's something in front of you still witnessing. You're witnessing this thing form. Now, hilariously, 6-7 is actually doing this via friendship and belonging of synchronicity of time. That's what's so hilarious about this, because it's like you're in any random moment. It is also interesting. It's numbers. Numbers are inherently this abstract signification that actually does not have any concreteness to anything particular in the world. I know some people who think numbers are real would argue with me about this, but the very fact that it could be so accidentally associated, right? In terms of like you're just randomly looking it down the name of the room number starts with number 6, 6, 7. You know what I'm saying? Like it could be completely called up at any time. Numbers have that power by their nature of abstractional, basically accidentalness. So you're not forced into any constraints by using it. And I don't disagree with any of your points, Daniel, about the kind of phonetic power of the sounds of it. The fact that it's 2 syllables, the way it sounds together, it kind of flows together. So it kind of has all those advantages. And it's 2 numbers right next to each other as well. And as Javier noted, you could do 11, 12, but it doesn't have the same kind of funness of sound. That's all together. I think it's very similar to like kids like making sounds of farts. You know, like I do think it's kind of a play. It's a play state. Play states don't have to make sense. You could just have fun, just for the sake of having fun, because it kind of reveals something about, Javier, I think it was Javier said it, or Ebert, I forgot who, I apologize, but freedom. This is kind of a joyful play, that the kind of act of this nonsensical statement reminds everybody of your freedom, that you can do this. And then, actually, it's almost why people think it's annoying, because you can have a serious conversation and do something, and then it comes up by accident, and you go, 6, 7. And then it kind of like breaks the discourse. It has this power of discourse breaking. I think it's kind of interesting about that. And I think what's going to happen is, I agree with Ebert's point about basically a semantic straining. We're really at this point again. It's an open question. Will this become basically just a landmark of a certain time period? Meaning that 6-7 is just the meme space of this time portal period in time of 2025. And then in 2 years, we forget about it, right? It just kind of fades away. Or does it become something more permanent, like what Ebert said about cool, where cool moved semiotically in meaning from temperature of a physical object to human subjectivity, right? People being cool. That's an open question. Because I only say that because that's why I bring up Dadaism, because Dadaism and that approach of the visual representation of letter forms it's the graphic design baseline. It's like something we just take for granted, we just use without even thinking about it.
Like it went from this completely avant-garde, basically strike of the beautiful, dare I say. That's actually what I'm about to kind of tease with at this point. And then kind of subsumed into a kind of everydayness. Look, of course we do this. Obviously, it's a goodness, a mode of goodness. But that's a little more speculative as a comment. But I do think that kind of realness is because you're kind of reminding people what's actually in front of you that language doesn't get at. That's what the Taoism try to do with visual form making. I see the 6-7 as a play of semiotic nonsense, semantic nonsense in gestural temporal play. That's what you're basically doing. And I think it's very important also to point this is not just a motivism. Like it's not just like it's not like most Brainrot, which tends to have usually a bodily sexual arousal valence reference, as Ebert said. What's important about it has a removal from that. That's why it's actually worth discussion. Because typically, if it's just a valence of arousal of some kind, then it's just a motivism, and we've seen plenty of that before. This kind of purposeful ambiguity of destruction semiotic reference is what's interesting about this of conversation. Let alone that who knew, as Javier said, it became a demonstration of literally the Sinthome of friendship, hilariously in motion, of synchronicity of belonging again in the motion of movement and mutual friendship of love. Who knew? As a strike of the beautiful. Who knew? Okay, that's all I got.
No, delightful, and I'll throw it to Michael here. Well, it's very interesting to think, and I appreciate what you were bringing up with kind of Walter Benjamin there, on the notion that mass production gets rid of aura, but then at a certain point, if you really copy-paste that bad boy, it gets a kind of new aura, right? It gets a kind of new sort of motion to it, which again would be suggesting Mr. Ebert's theory and work, because it's like there's a certain point where it actually comes back, right? You actually get that qualitative feature again. If you do enough repetition, if you do enough like redoing copy, if you do it enough, you get a new quality of experience. The question is, like, what is the difference between, say, that aura versus, say, 6-7 or something like that? It is also very interesting, too, because I think what you're saying, yeah, there's something about 6-7 that's permissionary. I know we've talked, like, it gives you permission then to kind of, you can have fun. It creates fun, right? It kind of, like, can come out any morning. It has a surprise to it, because you never know when it's going to occur. And then it's like, who spots it first? And so that also is all there. And it's interesting to think that in 6-7, there's a lot of the qualities that we have often discussed with encounterology that seem to be necessary for the possibility of belonging again, right? And I'm also just thinking, too, on this quite like what Mr. Ebert is suggesting with 6-7, this possibility in history of a signifier untied to the signified that give you this communal symptom. And it is hard to imagine that being like that is hard to imagine being possible without this nice mixture of video. Everyone has a camera to where you can catch it. You have the phone, you have the internet, you have higher enough quality video, you have quick videos. Like people have an app, they're looking for the quick video, right? So then, people are not, it's not like 6-7 and you wait 30 minutes, it's done and it moves on and you can find it. That kind of leads to the detachment and how that creates a certain motion that's going on. And I am thinking about that as it is structurally similar to what you kind of see in the apophatic that is operating there, right? Now, perhaps a danger, because now I'm thinking of various religious, and I'm not saying this necessarily in a moralization, but, there's always a warning in religions or organized religion for good and for bad, that the mystical can be bad, because once you taste the mystical, you no longer have the motivation to gain the virtues or to do the work. Like one of the worst things that can happen is you have a mystical vision and you're like, well, my novel's stupid. You never finish it because you've tasted it. Right? Like you don't do the work anymore because you've had that taste of the meaning and belonging early. So perhaps there's a danger in 6-7 in being so much like sort of the dance in Dante that then you're like, we'll just do 6-7 as opposed to economic, political reform, building new institutions, because that gives us the taste of what we want and we don't need to do that work, right? Like if I'm thinking of a religious parallel, that would be the day. And that's often too why churches could not like the mystical and they'd want to get rid of it, right? They'd want to get rid of all, because then once you taste that, you're like, well, I don't really care to do anything else but be in the all, right? Now, of course, that leads to its own pathologies once you get rid of all. But there's also some kind of wisdom in that as well, right? Because indeed, you can kind of say, what's the point, right? And that's kind of interesting to think that all can make everything seem meaningless. That you can have a taste of all, and then you're like, what's the point of everything else? That's kind of interesting as well. I'll have to think on that. Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir. We're talking about 6-7. Mr. Ebert brought 6-7. We're talking Shakespeare and metaphor. It's just great. But I'll throw it to Michael and then Mr. Ebert. Michael, thank you for being here, sir.
It's good to be here. Certainly not what I thought I'd be talking about, but it's fascinating. Yeah, just as that, I want to respond kind of, Daniel, to your question earlier about like is there a worshipful quality to 6-7, or like, kind of similar, I guess, modern language signifiers. But I was at a hockey game last week, and during one of the stoppages, they prompted all the fans to like break out in the 6-7 dance. And like they panned to like these kids first, and then, like it's like the kids are doing it and the parents are kind of like perplexed. But then like as they kept panning, like the amount of parents that were doing it as well, and like older kids, it was like I was like just thinking about it now, and I was like, I can't remember like a time where like as many people just like instinctively like did the same dance move at the same time, and it was just kind of this like cultural phenomenon that proliferated, like probably since Gangnam Style. Like that felt like the last kind of like just like culturally revolutionary. And then obviously like this isn't just a dance move. It's like it's like in the vernacular. It's like vocabulary. And I was thinking as like, Ebert was talking about his experiences with his kid and like her friends, and observing like how they use it, and kind of these moments where you kind of like don't really know something, or you're like, you're kind of just confused, and it's like, oh, 6-7, like, that's what we do. And kind of how that, might be similar to, like a mystical encounter of something that transcends language, right? Where, like in a Christian language, you might just say like, oh, well, that's God working, like we can't really understand what that is. It's like, it's God working. And but then I was thinking like how that, because like, I mean, there is something I think we can all agree that like 6-7 is not akin to religion. um but I was thinking, and I was like, it feels like even though it's something that kind of eludes language, or like eludes understanding, and it seems like it's kind of something that kids use to kind of like mock older generations, like it's kind of like an inside joke. It's like a one big inside joke that like the funny part about it is that other people don't understand, and they don't really even understand. But I think the fact that like that is so quickly at hand, and like there's a repeatable phrase, and there's a repeatable dance move, right? Like there's something kind of reductive about that. And there's something that actually kind of like destroys like the mystery that might actually be there. And I wrote down like on my post-it, like it seems like it's kind of like a drug to numb aporia. Because like you kind of have this thing that people don't understand, and you just do the same thing, and there's no nuance, there's no like there's no shift in circumstance, based on the circumstance. There's also no like curiosity to actually understand what it is. It's kind of just like, it's like a placeholder to kind of like fill the space. And I agree, with what everyone said. It's like it is this kind of cultural meme that gives people a sense of shared context and shared belonging, because it's like we're all doing the same thing, and you can see anyone on the street doing it, and you know what they're doing. But if that was all that it took to feel genuine belonging, then cults offer that sports team, you know, like anything where people are sharing in a you know, in a context. And so it's like, what are, you know, what are the ingredients beyond just shared context, shared identity, shared cultural meme that are like requisite for like genuine belonging and meaning? And it seems like, I mean, I think it is, for like, I was just looking on Reddit, you know, like as we were discussing, and I was like, what does 6-7 mean? And there was this teacher on Reddit who was like, I don't understand what this means. Like, all these kids are doing it. And someone else is like, that's the point. Like, there is no meaning, and they do it basically just to like spite you, to like, you know, basically make you feel like an ostracized, you know, outsider. And maybe there's something to that. Maybe, you know, maybe a lot of kids feel that way with adults in their lives. And it's kind of like a way of like, oh, like I'm, you know, I'm getting back at all the adults by like, you know, having this kind of inside thing. But yeah, I don't know. I was just thinking, like, even as we were all kind of, you know, thinking about kind of how fascinating it is, I guess just the cynic in me was like, this is also just fucked. This is also just stupid. But yeah, I'll throw it back.
But that's the point, man. That's the point. It is stupid. That's it. No, so there's a bunch of things like, so I'll throw it to Mr. Ebert here. So there's a few things. So first off, I think this does point at a lot of like you know, there has always been, again, a notion that mysticism is dangerous in religion because it gives people the fix, man. It gives them the fix. And then they're not doing anything in the community and they fall out, right? So churches don't do religion. They don't do mysticism. Well, that kills them, right? You lose the beautiful. And Jacob, good to have you, sir. But what you're saying to the compression, what did many of the American Protestant church do to spread? They took all that complicated theology and they just compressed it, baby. They just shrunk it as much as possible. And that's how you spread it, right? Now, the danger just comes further down the line if you then have various repressive pathologies that develop, because there is something repressive about compressive, right? But there's things to look at with the 6, you know, in the sense of, can one imagine AI learning like 6-7 and it's basically being a weapon where you could just, now that you know that if this is the age of the possibility of signifier that doesn't have a signified, is that like new today and that's a new form of weapon? Because you can just kind of launch that on the people and they all feel like they got meaning and belonging without doing anything to change the material condition of the world. And you've just got everyone in, you've got everyone in a simulation without putting them in a simulation, you know? Maybe it could be the ultimate weapon or something. Christian, good to see you. We're talking about 6-7. But then there's also the question on if studying 6-7 would actually give a lot of insight. Actually, like, wow, look at this thing. Like, what kind of revelation comes forth in 6-7, right? That in this pure sort of signifier without the signified, this pure motion, that it seems to connect with people on a sort of deep way, right? Or at least enough for people to go, yeah. Now, that could be used for ill. You know, everything good can be disordered into bad, as Mr. Augustine puts forth, right? But if that's what people are looking for, then, well, what can one do that's actually kind of taking that very seriously, right? Like, what kind of institutions, what kind of economy is there that creates this effect of motions and so on and so forth, right? So there might be something to learn, or it could be the ultimate weapon. Hard to say, but it is interesting to think of those possibilities. I have more notes here, but I'm going to pause and just throw it to Mr. Ebert here. Mr. Ebert.
I love that we're still talking about this. I do think it's a really rich topic. I want to refer to what Michael said. I do think that it could be an expression of aporia in the sense that it is simply an expression of the meaning crisis as opposed to a development of new meaning. That's possible. Ironically, very ironically, that's a very nihilistic take on the nihilism of language. The optimistic take actually is that the nihilism of language produces new horizons. I would also like to push back on the idea, just for the hell of it, but also with some reason, that it is inherently tantric as opposed to sutric, that it is spiritual, as opposed to the sort of sutric spirituality of a football game or whatever we have, in those instances, yes, we have togetherness and so on, but we have a determinate object of our concert. That is the game, that is the score, that is the players, that is something we can point to. In the case of 6-7, or the case of brain rot indeterminacy, it is the lack of something to point to that produces the apophatic immanence of the signified. In the same way as the lack of the ability to point at God produces the apophatic immanence of God. Now, I'm stretching this, but I do think that there is a synchronistic ritualism here that transcends the determinate focal of other workaday rituals that we can point to, like soccer games or football games or fucking, UFC or whatever those things are. Because there is the absence of the signified, we are immediately thrown into transcendental ritualistic territory. And I think that's fascinating. The other thing I wanted to mention, this is a sort of an aside that I just sort of woke up in the middle of the night thinking. So one of the primary drivers of brain rot, obviously, and definitely 6-7, is comedy. There's something inherently absurd. There's something funny. Now, one of the main, probably the main differentiator that I find unimpeachable between that classifies higher intelligence is the presence of comedy, the presence of humor. Now, language is like the thing we point to, right? As like, well, this is the manifestation of higher intelligence, obviously. The rest of the animal kingdom does not have language. Likewise, it's hard to point to, other animals in the animal kingdom that have a highly developed sense of humor. Now, what if language developed out of humor? What if the very production of meaning that we're seeing occur with 6-7 coming out of a saturation of repetition, a repetition automatism, and I do want to touch on the Sinthome thing, but a repetition automatism across a given culture or species of absurdity, an absurd act done over and over and over and over again, meaninglessness. Because ultimately, how do you produce meaning? How do you produce something? You have to have nothing first, right? But how do you get something out of nothing? Well, you reproduce nothing over and over and over and over and over again. And it is that quantitative saturation of nothingness that produces something. That's my metaphysics. That's Hegel's metaphysics. That's the metaphysics of the dialectic. It's the metaphysics of freak theory. And it seems to be the metaphysics of language. So what if language itself was produced, like what preceded language was laughter, and what produced language was a repetition of absurdity, of meaninglessness that eventually produced meaning. And I love the idea of monkeys laughing, preceding like the 2001 moment, preceding the real emergence of language is the absurd, because there must be some transcendent point, some interdeterminacy between the meaninglessness, like the absence of language, and then the meaning, and that there is a bridge there that I think that possibly humor played a large part in, which I find funny. Anyway, lastly, to just go on Sinthome, collective Sinthome, of course, anyone pushing back against that has no idea how cultures develop. Cultures are like any interiority is 100% fucking Sinthome. Totally neurotic, repetition automatism across the board. That is how literally the cultivation, like a culture in a petri dish, it is the repetition of the same bacteria over and over, and the multiplication of it until it saturates and produces something like a biome. You know, I mean, that is literally how the gut biome developed. You had a cavity and an organic cavity, and bacteria reproduced and reproduced and reproduced, copy pasted itself into the gut. So this production of Sinthome is directly tied to a repetition automatism that we would normally associate with some kind of mental illness. Why is that person constantly doing the same thing over and over and over again? It seems like a waste of energy. It seems inefficient. But that very inefficiency is what produces the scaffolding away from the, universal principle of least action that produces culture. Right. So anyway, that gets into a lot. I'm packing a lot into like just a single statement there, but absolutely. Just as an example, I went to a tea ceremony recently. It was Japanese tea ceremony. We were discussing on IDW how does culture develop, and I'm basically just arguing that you need the inane, the inefficient, the suboptimal. In order to build scaffolding away from the universal principle of least action, away from free energy minimization, so that you lift yourself sort of anti-gravitationally off of the convergence on a least action state of basic inactivity to produce something like a culture. So when I went to this tea ceremony, the amount of inordinate bullshit you had to do just to drink a cup of fucking tea was profound. And then when you drink it, you had to drink it in 3 1/2 sips. And then before you drink, you have to turn it 90 degrees in 2 rotations. And you have to get on the ground. You had to do so many things. And at one point, the teacher, literally this Japanese lady in in the full getup, goes, I don't even know. I don't know why we do this. And then she literally said, about 400 years ago, the shogun of Japan the shogunate wanted to remove Japan from being dependent on the cultures of, I guess, China and nearby neighboring states or countries or cultures, and wanted to have an interiority of culture. And so basically employed this guy to create culture, one of which was the tea ceremony. And all he did was create a bunch of inane activities that you had to do that diverted you from the drinking of the tea. So all these inefficiencies. So basically you create scenic routes that prevent you from getting on the freeway, and that is culture. And so, when we see the repetition automatism, we see like someone who is constantly we're like, why are you wasting your time like going like this? Why are you doing this thing? Well, it's because if I do this enough, I develop an interiority that is all mine, that is associated with this fucking bizarre movement that has no service to me outside of my own interiority. And that is culture.
That is wonderfully put. I'll throw it to Jake because he has to run. But first I'll just say that it makes me think of Pierre Bourdieu's distinctions. It makes me think of, like distinction comes from doing non-rational things. So if the ethic is being efficient, then everyone's going to become the same. There's no distinction, and that creates a lot of what people are seeing today. But let me throw it to Jacob here. Jacob, please.
Yo, good to be here. This is hilarious. I can't believe this is happening. My kid nephews would be laughing their asses off that I'm here with a bunch of grown adults talking about 6-7, and it would just validate everything about 6-7 for them, which was already validated when I recorded the 6-7 rap track with my nephew. Bueno, also thankful for Chance incident. I was super disorganized and then late and couldn't make it to the 7 p.m. Muay Thai, so I bought 30 minutes for this before I go to the 8 p.m. First thing I wanted to say is that kids be kids. Me and my brother, there was a lot of like really retarded kind of memes that we would just repeat in school over and over again that didn't have that much more sense to them than 6-7. But at the same time, my observation of the 6-7 generation, of which my nephews are part of, is very concerning to me, actually. The media environment they occupy. Like, I grew up with Batman cartoons and The Simpsons, and it was like things produced by adults for children. And now it's almost things produced by children for children, or like very young adults who are like the most algorithmically charged motherfuckers out there, like the kind of influencers and like the one shot trick videos. And this is what they watch. They just watch this stuff all day. There's no like narrative structure or arc or, and no, there's none of that structuring that you would have got watching Batman. So that is disturbing, and I wouldn't be surprised if that led to a kind of hyper memification of some kind as well. But yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that, 6-7, and enjoy the This is so pertinent. It's so like it's such a testament to the wisdom and brilliance of this space that this is being discussed here, because it's definitely not being discussed at Harvard right now.
Well, thank you, Mr. Kashir, and no, it's one, and thank you for stopping by, sir. I appreciate it very much. And yeah, it makes me think though, like even if 6-7 as the kind of like this new sort of pure motion or communal motion or different ways of the cultural Sinthome, the signifier without the signified, like if that actually can't help but also then participate in sort of this deeper apophatic meaning and belonging, it makes me think of this theological tradition where even in hell you find God. Like there's nowhere you can go and doesn't have the potential for a certain grace, because even at the nadir, it actually has the same structure as the apex, actually. And there's actually there's actually an ever hope in that, but it's an ever hope realized at the darkest bottom, right? But then if at the darkest bottom, it turns into salvation, then is it really the darkest bottom? And you always have those interesting sort of inversions going on, right? There's a few things that come to mind also as well. So I'm now thinking about that interesting idea. Yeah, like the repetition, like a lot of Catholics got really upset when the Catholic Mass stopped being in Latin, right? And they went, I guess, after the Second Vatican, they had more of, a lot of people critique Second Vatican as being too Protestant. It went in a Paulian direction. It was a lot more sermons with clear meaning. And people are like, no, that ruins everything. Actually, if you just have this repetitive ritual and you have no idea what's going on, that's actually better. And people like Dave Snowden will even talk about that, right? Because so it actually is better at holding the community together if you just have this repetitive ritual that people attend, but they don't really know what's going on. So it's interesting to think of that having a certain bit of this kind of 6-7 going on in it. I'm also thinking about, it's a very interesting point, because you were saying there, even on the football game, there's a clear determinant, like the team, right? So there's more of that going on. But when I say 6-7, I can't point to anything. It's interesting to think right there that, Seth, good to see you. So we're talking about 6-7. And it's interesting to think there that if the only thing I can point to with 6-7 is doing it again. Like I do 6-7 and I'm like, what does that mean? 6-7, like I have to just do it again. I can't tell you what it means. I have to do it again, right? So it's like pure act in that way. That's very interesting because all it points to doing it again, which spreads it, which then invites you in, right? So the pointing to is the reenactment that then actually is it. So that ever reenactment, which then I'm in it and I'm in the enjoyment of it, that's a very interesting dimension where if I point to the football team, I'm not on the football field, right? Like I'm in the crowd. There's a certain separation that's going on there. And also if somebody asks, what are you celebrating? I say, the football team. But if I say 6-7, it's like, you do it again, right? You do it again. And that's very interesting because, again, I know I keep parallel thinking about religions here, because then I think of like Bonhoeffer talking about like Letters in Prison, where he's basically like, at the end of the day, Christianity will become a bunch of individuals that have nothing to say to anyone. And what he's kind of pointing at is we'll get to this basically, well, indeterminate space where you have to be in it to get it. And if you get it, then it gets captured by Nazism or something, right? It gets captured by some sort of other force. And it's very interesting because, too, you see that kind of emphasized. Like, you have to get it to do it. Like, you have to step in. And it's interesting, though, and it's interesting because with, like, there's always this idea of like, if you do the thing, I can point to something that you'll get out of it, right? Like, let's say, I'll just take religious. Like, well, if you join the church, then you'll have a stable family life, you'll have a stable community, or whatever. There's something that's being pointed to it, right? But when you go in deeper into the histories of, in my opinion, when you go deeper into religions, ultimately it comes into a, no, it's not that. No, all those things they promise you, that's not actually what's delivered. It's in the thing that you get it, right? And there's almost a way where like the 6-7 is just that ultimate realization on the face. Like it's right there on the face, actually, at the very beginning, that anyone can get straight out the gate, right? That is, interestingly, seemingly only possible if the signifier is separated from the signified. That's very interesting. I'll throw it to if anyone has anything to say on this fine evening. I'm also imagining, like, we killed God, our knives are, unworthy of this blood, the earth is unchained from the sun, 6-7. Like that actually in the death of God arose 6-7 from the ashes, that by which all things will come. So, that's wonderful to think. I'm also interested by what you're saying about the laughter there. Laughter, absurdity. Well, it's interesting because if I say it's meaningless, then I can't say that without meaning. Like I know what that means, right? So if there is something about absurdity generating meaning, if you know it's absurd, then there's an interesting contradiction there, because if you know it's absurd, then you're grasping that meaningful, like the absurdity is meaningful to you, right? So there's a mixture in the realization of the absurdity that actually then opens up into the meaning, right? So when you laugh, right, like what does it mean, right? Like it kind of like you're laughing because of that doubleness, that sense of, I know this is crazy, I know this is meaningless, which means that it's meaningless, which doesn't make sense, saturation over laugh, right? Kind of laugh, right? Because there's a kind of you're caught in the middle of that, right? And then that leading to, thank you for coming, Brendan, wonderful to have you, sir. And that actually leading to determinations to articulate or to kind of get a grasp on that doubleness that occurs. To get a grasp on, well, I mean, a lot of determination ultimately is trying to get a grasp on this, situation we find ourselves in that's indeterminate with the I in parentheses, where it's both at the same time, which makes me think of Ebert. And that determinations are approaches, things that kind of spill out of that situation. So I'm thinking about that. 6-7! Okay, Mr. Jockin, please.
Jumping in. The thing about laughter, there's Aquinas has a whole conversation about this, about these, I forgot the term he uses. Basically, the human person is the only animal that laughs. There's a term for this. I forgot. I have to look it up later. But it's a attribute of not the definition of the object, but it's something coming with it. I think GJEC has a whole section about that. So basically, that the relationship of the body. Basically, the reason why humans have is because we have a relationship of the cognitive functions of surprise. Laughter is a violation of expectation. That's usually what humor comes down to, ultimately. And laughter is the bodily response to that surprise. We also can say that also because when people have a psychological terror, they laugh sometimes. Actually, I actually have a bad tendency of that. If really extreme, tragic events happen, I laugh in response to it. It's partly because, personal note, just the overwhelm of the encounter led to a laughter response. This is known as people psychologically do that too. So that's also interesting. That laughter, typically with humor, also has the quality of terror of response as well. So that kind of goes on both sides of that. I think that's just one note to share. Throw it back to the group.
Yeah. No, I'm now thinking about, like, if Umberto Eco was alive today and he's rewriting, The Name of the Rose, and the controversy there is that Aristotle wrote a book where God created by laughter, and the monastery, they're like, all the monks are terrified because if people got that, it would destroy the entire order. So, like, Umberto Eco would be all about that. Like, in the beginning there was the 6-7, so that's lovely. I'm also well, it's interesting because then on this notion of laugh leading to language. If laugh has a certain overwhelm to it, then in a weird way, language, it is meaningful because in a way it is reducing meaning in a certain sense. Like it's reducing, it's determining it, it's making it more intelligible and thus less meaningful, where actually the most meaningful thing is the laugh, because it entails both the horror and the absurdity and the joy. It entails all of that. And then if language comes from that, you're actually breaking it down in a sense. And yet you actually would say the words are meaningful, but not the laughter. When actually the laughter is most meaningful, but actually we can't get it, right? And that's what the 6-7 thing seems to be also kind of bringing out, right? Like the most meaningful thing possible is this kind of shared motion, if you just grant me that, without determination. Like that's the most meaningful thing possible. If you could get this shared motion, this sharing without it meaning anything, then that's the most meaningful thing possible, right? And it is interesting to think that that has a lot of theological tradition. That is around. And I think people, and again, I just go back to it, that's really interesting because I do think people in romantic relationships can have that as a kind of ideal. The possibility of just getting what the other person is saying. Like Michelle's an identical twin, and we talk all the time about how the kind of telepathy that seemingly twins can have, right? That actually creates a deep sort of intimacy, right? And that telepathy is precisely an intimacy that shouldn't be possible and that doesn't make sense and yet is, right? And so 6-7 also has a certain doesn't make sense and yet it is, and that's what you got to get, right? Like that's it, right? And you do it and you're in it. And it is very interesting to think that 6-7 would be pointing to all of that. But I will pause. Does anyone have anything to say on this fine evening? Well, thank you all for being here so that we could discuss 6-7. Mr. Ebert, thank you for bringing 6-7 to our attention this evening, sir. I greatly enjoyed it. It's been a blast. And thank you all.